In the exercise on Dolekaha, in the south of Ivory Coast, we proposed an exercise where you had to look for the dimension and the scope of a study. So we were in a context of competition for space between grazing land and annual crops, with social groups that were breeders and social groups that were breeders and farmers, and in a context of competition between the grazing land and yearly crops. The study concerns the management of forage resources, and it was requested in order to improve forage resources, which are beginning to be a problem. Therefore, what are the dimensions of this type of study? The management of forage resources would lead us to believe that there is a biological dimension which concerns the dynamic of forage resources, and a technical dimension which corresponds to herd management and therefore the management of the feeding system. But when we look a little closer, in fact, the 7 dimensions that are identified in the lessons are present and important. Insofar as the herds have an important economic function in terms of capital in particular, but also of income for the pearls, the economic dimension is entirely present in this situation. Insofar as we have several social groups, pearls and senufos, but that we also have the inhabitants of Dolekaha and the neighbouring inhabitants who use the forage resources of the village for their herds, we will have a social dimension which is very important. Also, the ideological dimension is important, meaning how do the users and managers of these forage resources that belong to Dolekaha, how do they represent the evolution of these resources? How do they take into account possible results of studies which show that resources are deteriorating? The legal dimension is also important because many rules regulate the access to different resources for the herds, be these the overnight parks, the points for drinking, or the grazing lands. So all of these rules contribute to allowing troop management to function or not, along with resource management. The political dimension is also present. Who decides that one can have access to this resource, this water point or this grazing land, and who, above all, decides how many animals can come and pasture in the village, in particular the neighbouring herds? How are these decisions made? So we can see that all of the dimensions are present in such a subject. The second question concerned the scope, and it was formulated: what global scope must we retain for the study so that each dimension is studied without forgetting any spaces, social groups or players? The simplest manner is to take each dimension and to ask the question as to what is the social scope, the geographical or the historical scope that must be adopted so this dimension is correctly treated. If we now take the biological dimension and the technical dimension, it is a question of the concrete relationship between herds and forage resources. So as there are outside herds that come and pasture on the forage resources of Dolekaha, we need to take these herds into account. So we will take into account the other animals and their owners, or the pearl cattle herders. To the contrary, insofar as the Dolekaha herds also pasture elsewhere, the spatial scope will be the parts that are pastured by Dolekaha herds. So maybe this is really marginal, and that following a very succinct pre-survey, we put to one side certain parts of pastures outside of Dolekaha that are pastured by the village's herds, but which correspond to less than 5%, for example, of forage resources. In this case, we can sometimes set some spaces aside when they're really not very important. For the social dimension, it's quite obvious that we will take the two social groups characterized by the ethnic groups present, meaning the Pearls and the Senufo, because both groups have animals. But we will also take the neighbors who are concerned, those that have herds that pasture in Dolekaha, or those that have land that is pastured by Dolekaha herds. There is yet another social group which does not apparently seem to be concerned by the subject. These are Senufo farmers that don't have herds. But insofar as they're in competition for the spaces dedicated to crops or spaces left fallow that will be used for forage resources, then we also need to take these into account. If we now look at the economic dimension, who must be taken into account? Well, in the same way, we will take the Pearls, we will take the Senufos, because they have different economic functions for their herds. And also the farmers in the economic dimension should also be taken into account. Why? Because they are the ones who use the manure from the herbs, in particular the manure that is collected in the overnight parks. Therefore, you need to take into account the farmers, but also the land chiefs. In the ideological dimension, we have seen that here it's a question of the representation that the stakeholders have of the grazing lands and the forage resources on the one hand, but also the herds. We have to take into account the users of forage resources, therefore the animal breeders, the managers, those that manage the land and those that manage the herds. And we also have to take into account all of those that intervene in the construction of the representation that the stakeholders have of the resources or the herds, in particular for resources, if there are technicians, if there are research teams that have obtained results on the status of forage resources. How are their results taken into account by the farmers and the animal breeders? These are questions that lead us to take into account these studies and therefore these technicians or researchers. How does the research centre intervene, the one that is in the Dolekaha area, and which carries out research on animal farming? Do they intervene to provide innovative elements for the management of pasture lands, or are they totally separated from Dolekaha inhabitants? Here there is a question that we must find a quick answer to in order to know whether we must include them or not in the scope of the study. Also, in the ideological dimension, when we apply this dimension to the representation of herds, there will be differences between the Pearls, who are only animal farmers and for whom the herd represents their entire wealth, both capital in terms of patrimony and sources of income, and also their work, their everyday work, and the Senufo, for whom the herd merely represents a capital. So here, of course, we must take into account the two social groups. For the legal dimension, we know that we have many rules that contribute to harmonizing or solving conflicts around the use of forage resources and land, but we often have a multi-layer of rules. We have local rules that are in principle oral and agreements, oral contracts between Pearls and the Senufo, for example, and we also have the land law. We might have had modifications of land rules and rules of appropriation. Therefore, in the area of legal aspects, we might need to adopt a far greater space, which can go up to the scale of the national level. Regarding the political dimension, which makes a reference to the way in which decisions are made, obviously, we must take into account the stakeholders that participate in decision-making, but we mustn't forget those that are subject to the consequences. In particular, do they give any legitimacy to the people who take the decisions? If the rules are changed, if there is a project to improve forage resource management, the way in which these new rules are put together, maybe with an external project, will this method be recognized? Will it be considered to be legitimate? Will these rules be accepted? So we We'll be taking into account local stakeholders that contribute to decision-making and making these rules respected. We take into account the local stakeholders that are subject to the decisions and also the external stakeholders that contribute to the modification of these rules. Projects, research organizations, or also the national framework around cattle breeding, for example. So we see that according to the different dimensions, the social scope, in any case, can vary. So what will be the global scope? Well, it will, after all, be all of the stakeholders that are taken into account for one or the other reason. Only during this study, we will not ask questions in all domains and to everybody. Certain dimensions, such as political or ideological dimensions, will lead us to interview a greater number of stakeholders than the technical dimensions may be, but on far more precise points. Concerning the scopes, we have a few indications. We know that in the 60s, part of the population migrated to the cities of the south to farm coffee and cocoa. At the beginning of the 90s, there was an economic crisis and the population started to come back into the country, and there was once again an increase in the population. It's from that time on that the competition for space really set in. I believe that we have to go at least back to the birth of this competition for space, meaning approximately at the time of this economic crisis, in order to understand how those who came back from the south or came back from the cities because they no longer had any jobs or because the coffee or cocoa was no longer being sold on international markets, how did they fit back into the village? And this brings out a new social group. Maybe these people will have to be taken into account as such, even if they are neither farmers nor cattle breeders, in order to see how what their experience is coming back to the village and what their experience is coming back into this territory. Therefore, the historical scope is at least as from the 90s. Maybe it's not necessary to go right back to the 60s. But during this survey, we will be able to change the historical depth of the study. So, the social scope is quite vast. Firstly, it goes beyond the simple inhabitants of Dolekaha. Secondly, it will be formed of the major social groups, which are the Pearls and the Senufos. Thirdly, the cattle breeders and the farmers will have to be taken into account. The farmers themselves, there are far more farmers than landowners. So the landowners also have to be taken into account as such. We know that due to the inheritance system, we have 5 landowners, but most of the village inhabitants are farmers for the Senufos. So here we have a far larger population. We have stakeholders that do not reside in Dolekaha. Firstly, the neighbours that use the pasture lands or whose pasture lands we use for the herds villages. We have the technicians. We have possible research projects or development projects on forage resources. We have the Research Institute on cattle farming, and which means a large and very diverse population. This does not mean we're going to be interviewing everybody. That's not our sample. That's not the list of people to be interviewed. It is simply the limits of the social groups, the boundary of the social groups that must be taken into account. Then within these social groups, we will form a sample where we can go and see all of the members of the social group. For example, the Pearl cattle farmers, there are 5 or 6 in the village, we can go and see them all. The landowners, there are only 5 or 6 of them, we can go and see them all. However, there are no doubt far more farmers, so there we will have to form a sample. We know that there are farmers who maybe have returned from a migration towards the city on the south, and maybe those are the ones that are really demanding land. So we have to form a sample that takes into account the history of the people, in particular with regard to these migrations of the 60s. So we mustn't confuse the scope and the sample, and we must realize that this scope, when it is identified on the social level, already allows us to list the different social groups. And therefore, to have an initial vision of the structure of the society with regard to our subject, and the structure of the society with regard to the different dimensions of the subject. I would like to once again underline the fact that we managed to form the social scope of the survey when we have looked at the different dimensions, and it's extremely fructuous in order to not forget part of the territories or part of the social groups involved.